It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in Chicago, September 1982. Sunlight spilled through the blinds of countless kitchens, illuminating breakfast tables scattered with newspapers, coffee cups, and the small, familiar bottles of Tylenol that had become household staples. No one could have guessed that beneath the label of safety and relief, a lethal threat waited silently, invisible to the human eye. Martha Sanchez, a young mother of two, reached for a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol to ease the lingering headache from a restless night. She shook the bottle, popped a capsule, and took a sip of water. Within minutes, she felt a crushing dizziness, a burning in her chest, and a nausea that would not abate. Her husband, returning from the mailbox with the morning newspaper, froze as Martha slumped to the floor unconscious. By the time paramedics arrived, her life had been extinguished in a way so sudden and silent it left everyone involved in disbelief. The city's hospitals were soon inundated with patients showing the same bizarre symptoms: dizziness, vomiting, convulsions. Doctors initially suspected food poisoning, viral infections, or allergic reactions. Yet, as the cases multiplied, patterns emerged, and a terrifying truth began to take shape. All victims had ingested Tylenol capsules. Police precincts scrambled to respond. Detectives pored over reports, interviewing relatives, friends, and neighbors, searching for any clue, any common thread that could lead to the perpetrator. The term randomness was whispered in strategy meetings. No clear motive, no discernible pattern. Whoever was responsible wasn't targeting enemies, nor were they seeking financial gain. They were playing a different game, one that weaponized trust. Word of the deaths spread like wildfire. Television anchors delivered grim bulletins, while radio stations repeated warnings, urging listeners to check their medicine cabinets and avoid capsules. In stores, shelves that once held bottles of Tylenol now stood empty, victims of a collective panic. Mothers clutched children to their chests. Fathers scanned receipts to see if they had bought the dangerous brand. Even the most mundane tasks, taking a headache tablet, giving a child medicine, became acts of terror. The investigation intensified as toxicologists confirmed what authorities had feared. The capsules were laced with cyanide, a chemical so lethal it could kill within minutes. The public's shock morphed into a gripping collective fear. Questions erupted across the nation. How could this happen? Who would do this? And most haunting of all, could it happen again? At Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of Tylenol, executives convened emergency meetings. They were faced not only with a crisis of public safety, but with a crisis of trust. Their brand, once synonymous with reliability and care, now bore the shadow of death. James Burke, the CEO, paced the boardroom floor, absorbing news of each new victim as the calls came in. His team debated recalls, press statements, and public reassurances. Yet every option carried risk. Act too slowly, and more lives could be lost. Act too hastily, and the company's credibility might never recover. Meanwhile, detectives combed through the city, visiting homes, interviewing pharmacists, tracing the paths of countless bottles. They scrutinized purchase records, delivery logs, and even postal shipments. The killer had struck with precision, targeting capsules after they had reached the shelves. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no apparent motive. It was a criminal's perfect crime, designed to instill fear, chaos, and helplessness. The narrative of the city itself seemed to reflect the growing panic. Streets emptied as children stayed home from school, parents double-checked every household product, and even casual shoppers avoided stores with an anxious, measured pace. Each ordinary act, pouring a glass of water, opening a bottle of medication, now shadowed by suspicion. Chicago, a city that had always pulsed with life, now vibrated with unease. At one apartment complex, elderly residents gathered to discuss the horror that had invaded their lives. "I've been taking Tylenol for 20 years, an older man said, voice trembling. "I never thought a pill could kill me." Their shared fear created a palpable tension, a quiet terror that spread through communities like an invisible poison. Parents scolded themselves for not paying closer attention, friends debated whether to throw away every medicine bottle, and strangers eyed one another with suspicion. The media frenzy amplified the horror. Nightly newscasts showed images of the innocent capsules, close-up shots of bottles lined up on counters, each a symbol of vulnerability. Newspapers ran detailed accounts of victims' lives cut tragically short: a young secretary, a mother of two, a college student preparing for final exams. Each story humanized the crisis, making the abstract fear intensely personal. Across the country, viewers were gripped by the same haunting realization: this killer could strike anywhere, at any time. Back in the police precinct, detectives hunched over a large map, plotting locations of the confirmed deaths. Patterns were scarce. The only certainty was randomness. This absence of logic, the inability to predict the next strike, intensified the psychological toll. Officers grew exhausted, haunted by images of victims' faces and the weight of responsibility that rested on their shoulders. And then came the calls from stores and pharmacies. Dozens of bottles had been reported suspicious. Panic escalated further as authorities realized the potential scope of the attack. Millions of capsules had been distributed nationwide. The possibility of more victims loomed large, an invisible clock ticking relentlessly.
The morning after the news broke, America woke to a reality that no one had anticipated. Headlines screamed across newspapers from coast to coast. Deadly Tylenol strikes again. Capsules of death. Crisis hits household medicine cabinets. Radio broadcasts repeated warnings hourly, while television news anchors, somber and urgent, relayed every new death with an intensity that left viewers glued to their screens. In homes across Chicago, parents hovered over medicine cabinets like sentinels. Every capsule, every bottle was examined with suspicion. Families argued quietly, debating which pills were safe and which should be discarded. Mothers refused to give children their usual morning doses. Fathers checked receipts to ensure they hadn't purchased the infamous brand. Even the most mundane task, treating a headache or taking a vitamin, had transformed into a calculated risk. Fear had become the invisible guest in every home. Meanwhile, the media frenzy only amplified the nation's anxiety. Every newscast featured live interviews with grieving families whose faces bore a mixture of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Nightly broadcasts showed rows of empty pharmacy shelves, bottles that once promised relief, now symbols of deadly betrayal. Reporters speculated endlessly about the killer's motives. Was it personal revenge, mental illness, or a desire for notoriety? Authorities offered few answers, which only fueled the public's imagination. At the epicenter of the crisis, detectives worked around the clock. Every lead, no matter how trivial, was investigated. Surveillance footage, store purchase logs, and witness statements were combed for patterns. Authorities knew that the killer had targeted capsules already on the shelves, making this a rare and terrifying form of crime: anonymous, random, and invisible. Police interviewed store clerks, pharmacists, delivery drivers, and even neighbors, yet every clue seemed to lead nowhere, deepening the sense of helplessness. At Johnson & Johnson headquarters, the pressure was almost unbearable. CEO James Burke faced a dilemma that extended far beyond public relations. It was a question of life and death. Emergency meetings convened at all hours, with executives debating how to respond. Should they recall all Tylenol products nationwide, despite the cost and logistical nightmare? Should they risk undermining public confidence by hesitating? The answers were not simple. Every decision carried consequences that could either save lives or destroy the company's credibility. On the streets, Chicago became a city gripped by tension. Pharmacies posted warning signs and locked capsules behind glass, but the damage was done. Parents kept children at home, workers eyed coworkers with suspicion, and casual shoppers avoided stores entirely. People whispered rumors, shared secondhand stories of friends and relatives affected, and debated endlessly about what measures would keep them safe. Fear had infiltrated the social fabric of the city, extending beyond the immediate threat of poisoned pills. It had become a psychological siege. Amid the chaos, law enforcement discovered a terrifying reality. The killer was patient, meticulous, and calculated. There was no pattern of timing, no geographic preference. The poisonings were random, yet precise, a crime executed with cold precision that left authorities frustrated and anxious. Every new death was a reminder that the murderer was always one step ahead, invisible and untouchable. As the crisis unfolded, the public's reaction became almost theatrical. People emptied stores of any medications, even brands unrelated to Tylenol, hoarding bottles like lifelines. Some families took extreme precautions, taping over bottles, wrapping them in plastic, or storing them in locked cabinets. Even the most rational individuals found themselves consumed by paranoia. Conversations once about mundane daily life now revolved entirely around safety, risk, and trust. The national media seized on this collective fear. Anchors interviewed experts on toxicology, product safety, and criminal profiling. Scientists explained the deadly properties of cyanide, while commentators debated the potential motives of the murderer. The story was dissected in countless talk shows, radio programs, and newspaper columns. Public interest was insatiable. Every death, every update became headline news, and the audience followed each development with a mixture of fascination and terror. Investigators, however, faced immense challenges. The absence of fingerprints, witnesses, or direct evidence left them grasping for leads. The fact that the killer could manipulate the distribution system without detection added layers of complexity. Detectives turned to behavioral profiling, attempting to predict the psychology of the culprit. Were they seeking notoriety, revenge, or simply chaos? Each profile suggested a different path, yet none led to a concrete suspect. In the midst of the frenzy, small victories provided brief relief. Authorities intercepted suspicious shipments and removed potentially contaminated bottles from store shelves. Families were warned to check their homes, yet every precaution was tempered by the haunting knowledge that a single, overlooked capsule could claim another life. The unpredictability of the killer created an omnipresent tension, a feeling that safety was an illusion. Within the Johnson & Johnson Crisis Center, executives weighed the consequences of every decision. Burke knew the stakes extended beyond corporate reputation. Public trust in medicine itself was at risk. The company decided to initiate a nationwide recall of all Tylenol capsules, a bold and unprecedented move. Millions of bottles were returned, store shelves cleared, and an aggressive public awareness campaign launched. Yet even as the company acted decisively, the fear lingered. The public's confidence was fractured, and it would take more than a recall to restore it. Communities began to adapt to the pervasive anxiety. Parents developed new routines, teaching children to question everything, to handle medicine with extreme caution. Friends and neighbors communicated constantly, sharing warnings and tips. Schools instituted discussions about safety, while local governments provided guidance on identifying tampered products. Fear had become a shared experience, binding communities together even as it drove them to suspicion and overcaution.
The city of Chicago and the entire nation was now gripped by a strange, suffocating tension. Ordinary life had become a gauntlet of suspicion. Each pharmacy visit, each bottle of medicine felt like a roll of the dice. And while fear ruled the streets, a quieter, more relentless pursuit was unfolding behind the scenes. Detectives, toxicologists, and federal agents were racing against time, against an invisible enemy who could strike anywhere, anytime. Inside the dimly lit precinct, the room buzzed with a sense of urgency that never slept. Maps covered the walls, dotted with red pins marking the confirmed deaths. Photographs of victims stared back from desks, each face a grim reminder of the stakes. Officers hunched over typewriters, phones rang incessantly, and investigators moved in coordinated chaos, chasing leads that seemed promising one moment and futile the next. Detective Frank Randall, a veteran of the Chicago Police Department, ran his hands through his hair, staring at a spreadsheet of recent victims. Every new death was a failure, every lead a shadow slipping through the fingers. "We're dealing with someone methodical," he muttered to his partner, Detective Lisa Marlowe. "This isn't random, it's calculated. Whoever did this knows exactly how to stay invisible." Leads were pouring in from all directions. Anonymous tips, suspicious sightings near pharmacies, mysterious phone calls and letters claiming responsibility. But the killer had perfected a cloak of invisibility. There were no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no obvious trail. It was as though the poison had a mind of its own, slipping through systems and safety measures with uncanny precision. The detectives began profiling the culprit. Behavioral experts suggested someone with a deep understanding of public systems and an appetite for chaos. Theories emerged: a disgruntled former employee of a pharmaceutical company, a thrill seeker seeking fame, or a deranged individual with no motive other than to watch fear spread. Each profile was examined, debated, and ultimately left unresolved. The killer was always a step ahead. Meanwhile, Tylenol executives were acting decisively. James Burke spearheaded a nationwide recall, pulling millions of capsules from store shelves. Press conferences were held daily, warning the public and urging cooperation. Despite these measures, panic persisted. Families continued to hoard bottles, and even unrelated medications were treated as dangerous. Fear had seeped into every corner of daily life, creating a psychological toll as devastating as the poison itself. In the midst of this, near misses added tension to the investigation. A family in suburban Chicago discovered a suspicious bottle just in time, its seal broken and the capsules tinged with an unnatural color. A store clerk remembered a man who had lingered near the shelves, examining capsules in a way that now seemed sinister. Every small clue sparked hope and dread simultaneously. Hope that the killer might be caught, dread that they were still at large. Detectives began to notice a chilling pattern in these near misses. The poisonings were not purely random. They had been carefully calculated to instill terror and distrust. It became clear that the killer's goal was not just death, but psychological domination. Every poisoned capsule, every sudden death was part of a grander design to erode confidence in a nation that had long taken medicine for granted. Federal agencies became involved, bringing in additional resources and expertise. Forensic laboratories worked tirelessly, analyzing capsules and attempting to trace the origin of the cyanide. Experts examined distribution chains, manufacturing processes, and storage facilities, but every line of inquiry seemed to hit a wall. Cyanide was a common industrial chemical, easily obtained, and the killer's method left no traceable fingerprints. It was an investigation that demanded both meticulous detail and near-perfect intuition. Pressure mounted not just on law enforcement, but on the public. Fear was contagious. Children were kept home from school, grocery stores remained sparsely populated, and even workplaces saw reduced attendance. Conversations revolved around safety, how to identify tampered capsules, whether to trust other over-the-counter brands, and how to protect loved ones from an unseen threat. Every household became a mini fortress against an invisible enemy. The detectives' frustration deepened as false leads began to consume time and resources. Anonymous letters claimed responsibility, only to be dismissed as hoaxes. Tips on suspicious behavior led to nothing. Every dead end reinforced the terrifying reality. The killer was meticulous, patient, and brilliant in their anonymity. And while the investigation stalled, the killer's shadow continued to loom over the nation. Yet, despite the despair, law enforcement made small strides. One investigator noticed an unusual pattern in the batches of capsules linked to victims. Another traced a shipment discrepancy that hinted at the possibility of tampering at the retail level rather than during manufacturing. These breadcrumbs provided fleeting hope, evidence that perhaps with relentless effort, the invisible enemy could be found. The narrative also explores the human cost of this terror. Families were left traumatized, reliving every moment of trust in an ordinary pill that turned fatal. Survivors experienced paranoia, unable to distinguish between safe medicine and poisoned capsules. Medical personnel faced moral strain, knowing that one overlooked detail could mean another death. Even the detectives themselves were not immune to fear. Each investigation felt personal, a race against a murderer who could strike in their own neighborhoods. In the middle of the night, another death was reported. A college student collapsed in her dormitory, a bottle of Tylenol nearby. Investigators arrived swiftly, yet the scene mirrored the previous tragedies. Panic surged in tandem with frustration. The killer had struck again, undeterred by media scrutiny, police vigilance, or corporate intervention. The randomness and precision of the act left everyone questioning whether safety could ever truly be restored. Months had passed since the first victim collapsed in her Chicago kitchen, yet the terror of the Tylenol murders had not faded. The killer had vanished, leaving no fingerprints, no confessions, no traceable motive. The nation, however, was irrevocably changed. What had begun as a shocking act of violence had grown into a lasting cultural trauma, a reminder that the everyday objects once taken for granted could be weaponized in an instant. At Johnson & Johnson headquarters, James Burke reflected on the crisis with a mix of sorrow and determination. Lives had been lost, families destroyed, yet he knew that inaction would have caused far greater harm. The company had acted boldly, recalling millions of capsules, implementing new safety protocols, and communicating relentlessly with the public. Tamper-proof packaging, once considered unnecessary, was now mandated, a permanent testament to the lessons learned from one criminal's calculated cruelty. The public's reaction was a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Many families discarded every bottle of medication, some leaving shelves bare for months. Parents were cautious even with unrelated medicines, questioning labels, seals, and expiration dates. Stores implemented strict monitoring of over-the-counter products, and pharmacists became vigilant gatekeepers of safety. It was a society transformed by trauma, hyper-aware, suspicious, yet resilient. Detectives, despite their relentless efforts, never identified the murderer. The investigation became a study in frustration, an example of a criminal operating with clinical precision. Behavioral analysts speculated endlessly. A disgruntled employee, a thrill seeker seeking infamy, a deranged individual with no rational motive. But all remained conjecture. The absence of closure left families haunted, and the shadow of the killer lingered in the collective imagination. Survivors and families of victims struggled with long-term consequences. Grief was compounded by the unsettling knowledge that justice had not been served. Some withdrew from public life, fearing that another invisible danger could strike at any time. Others became advocates for product safety, lobbying for tighter regulations and stricter industry standards. The murders had not only taken lives, they had sparked a cultural reckoning with trust, vigilance, and the fragility of everyday security. The media continued to dissect the events for years. Documentaries, articles, and interviews examined the Tylenol murders not just as a crime, but as a social phenomenon. Analysts explored the psychology of the killer, the corporate response, and the public reaction. The story became a cautionary tale, a vivid illustration of how ordinary life could be upended by a single calculated act of terror. Each retelling reminded the nation that safety is never guaranteed, and that vigilance can be both a burden and a shield. At the community level, the impact was profound. Schools introduced lessons about product safety, teaching children to identify tampering and remain alert. Parents enforced new routines. Medicines were locked away, capsules inspected, and strangers approached with caution. Neighborhoods shared warnings, creating a collective network of vigilance. The killer's invisible hand had reshaped daily life, leaving a culture of caution in its wake. Law enforcement, though unable to catch the perpetrator, refined techniques that would benefit future investigations. Forensic toxicology advanced, distribution tracking became more sophisticated, and collaboration between local police, federal agencies, and corporate entities set a precedent. The Tylenol murders, while tragic, drove innovation in crime prevention and investigative methodology. Detectives carried the memory of the victims like a torch, guiding reforms that would save lives in the future. Yet the story was not solely about fear or tragedy, it was also about resilience. Johnson & Johnson's decisive response became a case study in corporate responsibility. The swift recall, transparent communication, and implementation of tamper-proof packaging restored public confidence over time, proving that decisive action could mitigate disaster even when the perpetrator remained unknown. Burke's leadership became a model for handling crises, demonstrating that integrity and rapid response can rebuild trust even in the aftermath of terror. The legacy of the Tylenol murders extended beyond medicine and corporate policy. It became a touchstone for public awareness, illustrating that ordinary life contains unseen vulnerabilities. The idea that an everyday household item, trusted, familiar, and ubiquitous, could conceal lethal danger resonated deeply, shaping public consciousness and policy. Families became more cautious, corporations more vigilant, and law enforcement more prepared. The event had altered the very fabric of American life, a subtle but permanent imprint on society's understanding of safety and trust. As the years passed, memorials and reflections preserved the memory of those lost. Families marked anniversaries with quiet remembrance, communities held vigils, and journalists revisited the case, ensuring the victims were never forgotten. The Tylenol murders became not just a cautionary tale, but a somber chapter in the history of crime, a reminder of human vulnerability, the limits of control, and the resilience of those left behind. The story closes with a haunting image, a mother examining a medicine cabinet, a child asking for a simple dose of relief, and a bottle of Tylenol sitting on the shelf. The seal is intact, yet the shadow of the past lingers. Trust has been restored, but the memory of what could have been remains etched in the mind, a subtle, invisible reminder that ordinary objects can hold extraordinary danger. Somewhere, the killer remains a mystery, anonymous, unseen, unpunished. The murders may have ended, but the fear, vigilance, and lessons endure. Society learned to navigate a world where even the most familiar things could conceal lethal threats, and where responsibility, awareness, and courage were essential defenses. The Tylenol murders did not just claim lives, they reshaped a nation, leaving behind a shadow that continues to warn, teach, and haunt. And in the quiet moments, when a pill is swallowed for relief or a child asks for medicine, the memory of that September in 1982 returns, silent, pervasive, and unforgettable.